Good day, everybody. Great to be here with you. And you can see the start of my title here is all about flow. So I'm sure that resonates with everybody here at a conference called Flowtopia. Also going to talk about something called the Constructal Law, which comes from physics and may be new. And so we'll try to knit that together in this discussion with what does that have to do with flow and our value streams. A key thing I want you to consider as we get into this is that flow long predates value stream management. We've been thinking about flow in society, but of course nature's been thinking about flow even before we started to think about it as people. And so my ask at the beginning of this presentation is when I start to think about how the flow that you're working with in your value streams, how does that potentially connect with other flows in nature, other thinking about flow that we've done? To get started, to ground this discussion, I want to just take a minute and ask ourselves, what is flow? And this is a quote from Adrian Bejan. We'll talk a lot about Bejan's work throughout this discussion. He was the creator of the Constructal Law. And so he says, what is flow? It's pretty simple, right? Flow is the movement of one entity in our value stream in some other kind of channel relative to another, the background, what's around that channel, around our value stream. And so to describe flow, we speak of what's in the flow. It could be fluid or mass, in our case, information or products. And we talk about how much it carries, so our flow rate, things like that, and where is it located. So all basic stuff, but just to ground ourselves. What we may not have thought about, though, is what is a flow system. So we're all could describe flow, but we haven't maybe used this term of a flow system. So Bejan defines a flow system as one or more streams, so in our case, value streams, that originate from points and must find easier access to other points. So just to unpack that a little bit, all flow goes from one or more points in the world to one, and then they're going to go to one or more points. So flow can be from one to many points, from many to one, many to many, and so on. But basically, a flow system is getting something from one set of points to another. And everything that moves or flow, animate or inanimate, doing that kind of thing is a flow system. So on the right is a picture of a metropolitan transit system we can all kind of relate to. And a key thought here as we go through that this didn't happen randomly, or this just wasn't what in some artist's head. The structure of this came about in trying to optimize the flow from one set of points for people and maybe people in their packages or their pets from one set of points to another. So these flow systems evolve in response to trying to optimize, to increase the access to what is flowing through the systems. And the good thing about flow is it turns out that they can be described by physics. And this is important because if you think about other things that we try to do, it really helps when we can describe it by physics. So that's why we can now build huge bridges over huge valleys or rivers because we understand the physics, or we can fly airplanes and so on. So the premise in this talk is to the extent that we can apply physics to our value stream work, we can get the same kind of goodness that we've got in other domains. And again, if flow is is driven by physics, then the designs we see in nature for flow are going to arise naturally, but not randomly, right? They're going to be in accordance with physics. So a diagram from one of Bejan's books at the right shows a lot of flow systems, right? A lung, leaves, water that's dried up on a mud bed, the evolution of locomotion of animal, ink drops, and so on. And so all of these structures arise in accordance with physics. And in fact, this statement I love, Bejan says that the whole universe, in fact, is a flowing, tree-shaped, interconnected, and hierarchical architecture. So a lot to unpack there, and we'll do that. Here's a top-down picture of a river, and you can see that rivers and deltas, as the statement there, are themselves because they're flowing water from one set of points down to the ocean, down to the delta. They start to adopt this tree shape, and you see that in nature. And so tree configurations naturally emerge from a common tendency to provide greater access between a point and an area or volume. So what's that last part mean here? So a tree, if you imagine the base of a tree, that's one point of things that there's nutrients that have come up for the roots. those nutrients need to get up to the leaves. So the trees have evolved a structure that optimizes the flow of those nutrients from that point at the root of the tree up out into the leaves. And of course, part of what makes a tree so beautiful is that it's also optimized the other way around, so that the energy that's coming in through the leaves finds its way back from these many points down into that point at the base of the tree, and then out again to the many points in the roots. So tree, after this talk and you walk outside, start to realize that the trees around us are great examples of flow systems. And this flow architecture, because it's part of physics, applies to all kinds of things in nature. And so on the right is a close-up picture of a lung. And you can see, if you look at that, hey, it turns out that our lungs are shaped like trees if you look at them up close. And Bejan's point is, it didn't have to be that way, right? But it turned, if it was just random, lungs could have looked like anything. But no, it turns out that they have the same similar tree structure. And the other part of the paragraph on the left there gets at the fact that it also turns out that our lungs have this nice periodic breathing flow, these nice iterations of our breathing. And it didn't have to be that way, but sure enough, it is. And so if that was because of physics, we might think about that when we think about some of the cadences that we have within our value streams, some of the rhythms in our value streams. It turns out those can be more or less in accordance with what physics tells us. So on the right here is a picture of another flow system, right? A circulation system in a body. And again, you can start to see the tree structure starting to emerge. And once we start to see that, we start to see that everywhere. So in this picture, in this slide up on the left here, you've got coral. So it turns out coral, when you look at it close, these tree structure is embedded there because coral is optimized for flowing the water that's around it, taking the nutrients out of the water and out them. So those are highly evolved flow systems. Of course, the leaf to the right part of the tree structure. On the left, here's a human system. So this is air traffic, commercial air traffic across the globe. And when you start to look at that, you'll start to recognize similar patterns. And then another domain, if you look inside our heads and if you look at one of our neurons, it turns out, hey, there's tree structures there. And that's a case where from one set of points on the left, a system that's evolved to flow flow signals to the set of points on the right. So I mentioned Bejan, so Dr. Adrian Bejan, our hero, I call him here. So he's a distinguished professor of mechanical engineering at Duke. And so what does a mechanical engineering do in talking about physics or talking to us? So fair question. And he got started by, in his research in his labs, he was involved with how to look at the flow of heat or heat transfer with high density electronic equipment. And so he got very involved in just, with his mechanical engineering hat, how to flow heat in and out of electronics. But because he's kind of a generalist by nature, he started to realize that that's part of these other patterns. And he was kind of part of the discussions of thermodynamics and folks like Prigogine and things like that. And he said, hey, some of these patterns that we see in nature are not random. And from that, the more he thought about that, he formulated what he called the Constructal Law. And again, it's a law of physics that applies in a lot of domains. And so here's his statement of it, and we'll just take a minute and unpack this. So for a flow system to persist in time or to live, so that's a key thought there, that right, for something to live, persist in time is that to live. So our organization is going to persist in time and stay alive, right? In order to do that, its configuration must evolve and continue to evolve so that it's always providing easier access to the currents that flow through it. So with a living organic system like the tree on the left, right, when that tree stops to grow its flow and try to enhance its flow from the roots to the leaves and back and forth and so on, then it starts to die and will eventually die. Same for our organizations. If our organizations are not continuing to evolve, to enhance the flow that goes through them, then they start to die and will die. If you take a riverbed that's no longer figuring out how to flow water, it doesn't have water going through it, it will die and just become a dried up riverbed. And again, just to restate this yet again, this constructor law is revolutionary because it's a law of physics. You can see in the picture on the right, in one of his books, he works out how to apply to the evolution of all kinds of things. From this one picture he shows on the bottom, things trying to move in the water, from early fish to submarines, or on land up to cars, or from birds to airplane. And it turns out he kind of works out how the constructal law predicts the evolution of all those systems. And because it's physics, it applies not just in one domain, but it applies to biology, geology, engineering, inanimate systems. It applies to social systems, economies. And the premise of this talk is that it's going to apply to our value streams, that our value streams are designs, and they're going to evolve according to the same law. And so the more that, just like with other things in our life, the more that we understand the physics of it and can work in conjunction with physics, kind of go with the flow of physics, we'll have much better success as opposed to if we're fighting it. So that's cool, right? We looked at some fun pictures, maybe had some abstract thoughts, but how can we apply this constructal law to our value stream management tasks? And so I would say that there's, I'm going to propose three ways. We're going to talk about supporting freedom. We're going to talk about embracing hierarchy. Sometimes we run away from hierarchy. We're going to talk about embracing it and pursuing beauty. So to get into the idea of freedom, we started to talk by looking back, hey, even before humanity, right? Nature's been flowing water and all kinds of stuff around. But even if we come into human history, a lot that we can learn from. And the quote on the left there is that at the fact that if you look at any society over time in history that's produced more and it's been longer lasting, contributed to our world history in a good way, it turns out that if you look back at those, you'll see that they were endowed with freedom and hierarchy, ability for free questioning and self-correcting feedback loops. And the reason for that is just fundamentally, it's easy to create in freedom. And again, if you look at history of art and science, you'll see that. So famous place that some of you may have visited is Florence. And if you go back in time for Florence during the Renaissance, where you had Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, that whole cast of characters, right, creating the Renaissance in and around Florence. Well, if you look at that, that was a time when there was all kinds of freedom. They had enough wealth so that they had freedom to think about art and beauty. There was political freedom, mindset freedom, social freedoms, where that could create. Or to take a more recent example, if you look at Silicon Valley, which is still ongoing, of course, and some combination of forces there created a sense where people had the economic freedom, business freedom, social freedom, resources and everything to provide a freedom to kind of create this amazing outpouring of innovation and world-changing design that has come out of Silicon Valley and continues to date. So that will go on for a period of time, but hundreds of years from now, people will look to Silicon Valley in the same way that we look back to Renaissance Florence, and then when they study that, they'll say, "Hey, there was a really important element of freedom there." So I'd look at that from the positive sense, but now to turn to the kind of the counter. What if you don't have freedom? And pretty bluntly, Bejan tells us that organization and evolution cannot happen. So again, we talked early on that in order for something to stay alive, it's got to be evolving, refining itself. And if it doesn't have freedom to change, that's just not going to happen, so it's going to die. And this chart helps to tell that story for us. It bring this kind of back to our value stream situation. So if you look on the right, a typical thing where we've got flow, we're flowing value to our customers, we're getting feedback from our customers. Great, and so we've probably seen that chart a lot, but what I'm suggesting here is we sometimes forget that what's in the oval there, we need freedom to adapt. Because if we get feedback from our customers, but we don't have the freedom to respond to that, we're not going to change our product. We can't change our process for delivery and so on. It's absolutely essential to have that third F. We need feedback and flow, but we also need freedom. And to create that freedom that we need, there's several levers, at least these, right? Mindset. We need a mindset of freedom so that we can that just mentally we can say, hey, this is something that contradicted what we were thinking. We got to change our thinking or change our approach. There's a mindset aspect of that. Our teams also need the policy things so that they have permission, sort of legal permission to change what they're doing and pivot as needed, and then processes and tooling, right? In our value streams, we need tooling and processes that enable us to change what we're doing, change our product, change our processes in a timely fashion. And to give an example of accomplishing this, something I know pretty well is, I want to talk about is the Scaled Agile framework. So I'm a SAFe SPCT, so I have the highest level of certification in SAFe, so spend a lot of time thinking about SAFe. And I just brainstormed on the left there some of the ways that freedom pervades SAFe, places that you would find how freedom is intrinsic and SAFe, and I believe really key to why SAFe or similar kind of frameworks are successful. So just to go through a few of these. Building incrementally, right? One of the reasons that we build in increments is at the end of the increment, we can change, right? If we just had some big blob, classic waterfall schedule, you don't have that, you don't have those freedoms to pivot. So increments allow us to learn and change. That's a form of freedom. And of course, iterations, just taking that even to a finer grain, right? Iterations at every scale, from the portfolio level down to the team level, with small batches. The faster that we iterate, the smaller the batches, the more freedom we build in. SAFe, we need solution intent. Even in Agile, we need to know where we're going. But SAFe teaches us, hey, maintain a variable aspect of that solution intent. Just grow the fixed solution intent gradually, so you maintain that freedom to incorporate what you're learning. Fist of Five, that you may not have heard of that if you haven't been involved with SAFe, but if you've been to a SAFe event where people were going to give a confidence vote, you would have seen folks use the Fist of Five. So teams all together, we're just doing all this planning. Are we confident? Can we commit to it? And we ask people to show either 5 fingers if they're fully committed, fully bought in that this is going to work, or 1 or 2 fingers on the other extreme if they're thinking, hey, something's not right here. I don't think this is going to work. I got a concern. And that's a freedom issue, because that only works if you give people the freedom to raise 1 or 2 fingers, to say, hey, we just spent 2 days planning, but I'm not on board with this, right? We're not ready to launch. So that's a form of freedom that's baked in there. Set-based design, right? When we teach that if we're designing things, we need to maintain multiple options as long as it makes economic sense. Lean startup, if you think about the lean startup and the MVP and the ability to pivot once the MVP on track or not, a form of freedom. And then, of course, we also need shared vision and guardrails. Freedom that cannot just be everybody just doing what they think about waking up in a new universe every morning completely randomly, right? We need a vision and guardrails so that our freedom is productive. And it turns out, even if you look at Florence or artists and things like that, they make use of various kind of guardrails to shape the productive freedom. Ignoring sunk cost, another great example, right? We spend a lot of money, something that hasn't worked out, but we're free to pivot as we need to. Decentralizing decision-making, of course, or architectural runway, if you're familiar with that, that's building ahead of time of where our development teams are going to be working on. And that gets at it providing the tooling or the processes that our teams are going to need and provides a certain form of freedom because they can change. They have the tooling that they need to adjust what they're delivering. So at the bottom, this is not an official SAFe slogan at all, but something I've been thinking about a lot lately is you could think about, what does SAFe stand for? You might start to think, well, it stands for scaled accountability and freedom, because freedom is really intrinsic to SAFe. So we talked about freedom. I talked about the second of our levers here, which is to embrace hierarchy. And I put a question mark after that, only to raise the point that a lot of times we think hierarchy is bad. We think of broken down bureaucracy and so on. But the point of this slide, so this is a picture here in the slide, is a bunch of single cell organisms. And without hierarchy, there would only be single cells, no multi-cell organisms. If you think of our body, human bodies, it's actually pretty hierarchical. We've got a choice between losing a fingertip and losing an eye. That's a pretty easy choice. They weigh about the same, but there's a clear hierarchy in our bodies. So harmony of movement is hierarchy. Bejan tells us hierarchy is good for life and the performance of the whole. And you can see this, a picture on the right, upstream from this, rain has fallen, the little droplets have merged into bigger droplets, formed rivulets. The rivulets in this picture are starting to come together, and then they get into a stream, which will go into a river and maybe into a bigger river. This happens all the time around us. And the quote from one of Bejan's books on the left there, he kind of tells the story of this the stream. He says this is natural, this is morphing in freely. But scientists look at this and they're hesitant to call this hierarchy. They might call it multi-scale, dendritic, fractal. It's a popular one, but Bejan says, hey, deal with it, accept it, call it courage, and use courage and call it hierarchy. So that's two of our legs. The third of our ways is to pursue beauty. Why beauty? Well, something that is beautiful is attractive. We're drawn to it, right? And if you think about making things flow, it's not enough to have the perfect channel and the perfect tooling. You need some kind of motivating force, either a push or a pull. So beauty, the more that we think about trying to create beauty, pursuing beauty, will provide a pull for flow through our systems. And one key aspect of beauty is taking a holistic view, right? If we take a holistic view, that gets us out of, in the case of science, out of very compartmentalized science. We can think about bigger pictures, or in the value stream world, that's a big part of the DevOps revolution, right? Is that what's the total picture? Let's don't get away from our stovepipes. Let's think about the whole value stream. Let's think about the whole development, security, operations, all those things that we put around in the DevOps and our value streams. Think about that as a whole. Or we also think about whole product design. So holistic thinking is one of these key things associated with beauty and will be in accordance with the Constructal Law. And again, just to state that yet again, the future of the whole is the important picture to paint, is a quote from Bejan, because nothing operates in isolation. Every flow system is part of a bigger flow system. If it's our tree, right, the tree is part of a large, the tree is pulling water out of the soil up through the leaves into the atmosphere, but that's part of a system, and the local winds are taking that water from the leaves and that into bigger systems, and maybe raining someplace and picked up, rained back down into a current, into the oceans around those currents around the globe. So our flow systems are always part of a bigger system. And that's certainly in the case of our value streams. As individuals, we're part of a team, which is part of a value stream, which might be blended with other value streams. Our customers, we're getting their job to be done, but that job to be done is part of a larger enterprise. And so we're interdependent. And this, if we think about this intentionally, can be a great source of harmony, balance, and oneness in nature or in our economic situations. So great, how do we get going? If we bought into that, so I've adapted this from Bejan's work here just to make it fit on a screen, but really a three-step thing to get started in designing value streams with freedom and discipline. First, define your system. My bachelor's degree was in chemical engineering, all kinds of flow systems, and our professors just got ahead. Define your system. What's in the system? What's out of the system? And that system that we're thinking about, we're kind of part of that system. It's ours. It belongs to us. The system's part of us. Everything else in the environment is surrounding the rest of the world. We got to be clear what's in our system, what's not. Then identifying what's flows and why are we doing this? If we know what's flowing, why are we doing this? Why do we need to provide freedom to our system, which there's expense to doing that. We need to know our why. And then of course, start simply. Find one thing for evolving a current environment, experiment and learn your way through it. So I started by asking, hey, just think about how our VSM work connects with flow more broadly. But here my ask is to take it another level and explore for yourselves. I've kind of tried to introduce constructal theory here in a whirlwind tour, but I'd really encourage you to look at one or more of these books and start to explore this for yourself. He has a number of books, but these are 4 books which are meant for the general audience. All of them would be great. If I had to pick one, I would suggest starting with Design and Nature on the left, but all these are great. And also look for next year, I'm going to publish something with IT Revolution Press to take these ideas about the Constructal Law of Physics and applying it to product development and develop a little bit more detail and formally than I've done today. So turns out I conclude with this thought that to flow is flourish. I actually looked up the etymologies. I thought those were related. I've always loved the concept of flourishing and flow, and I had gSPT do the etymology for me, and you can do that for yourself. But it turns out those are really deeply rooted words. So I just kind of conclude with that. Hey, to flow is flourish. Really great to be here with you today at Flowtopia, and happy to respond to your questions either in this period or after. You'll have my contact information. Thanks.